we often thought
Yes.
that Elizabeth was dead set against divorce. She really understood divorce because not just Margaret, close members of her family had got divorced early on, but she also understood it curdled when it came up against monarchy. And that's the problem, that's the failure, that the expectation was so high because of their success that Charles and Diana could only really fail.
Well, our late Queen, Elizabeth II, and her husband, Prince Philip, achieved the highly unusual distinction of being married for more than 70 years. And poignantly, the Queen, who was pictured alone at the Duke's funeral during COVID restrictions, did not survive him by very long. And the two are now buried together at Windsor Castle. The marriage is celebrated and analysed in a new book, Elizabeth and Philip, by the historian Tessa Dunlop, who joins me now in the studio. Welcome back to Times Radio.
Thank you.
In your book, you make much of the symbolism of the marriage in 1947 for the Queen's generation. After the promiscuity of the war years, marriage was highly fashionable and it was seen as a cornerstone of stability. Is that right?
Yeah, I was very struck by the way in which they were used, is a slightly derogatory term, but certainly mobilised, if you like, by both church and state. There was considerable anxiety about a moral deterioration. There'd been this huge bumper crop of weddings in 39-40, and equally there's this kickback of divorce, uncertainty, promiscuity in the latter war years. And this was a way of Britain morally reasserting itself. And I was quite fascinated in the newspapers that we were very keen to distinguish ourselves from America. You know, we don't want to be like them over there stateside with all their divorces. In 18 years, they think that 50% of Americans will be divorced, they said somewhat prophetically. And this was the perfect couple, the unimpeachable, virginal princess with rose-pink cheeks, her handsome lieutenant who had been freshly pressed as a reformed, if you like, as a Brit, a sailor, a loyal Anglican. I think he just converted from Orthodoxy. So and they were beautiful.
Why did the Queen choose him?
She fancied him, properly had a teenage crush. I was very struck by that, actually, in some of the Windsor diaries. As early as 1940, she's cutting out press cuttings for her scrapbook. She's aged 14. It's rather sweet. And it struck me because quite a lot of guff was spoken about the Queen during the memorial period and the 10 days of mourning. But some things did really ring true, and one was that word steadfast. She was absolutely steadfast in her certainty that Philip was for her. Because I was equally struck by the court were unsure, her own family were unsure, her mother was never a big fan of Philip's.
Yes, tell us about that. Why did so many in the royal family think that Philip was unsuitable?
They thought he was vulgar. They were concerned he wouldn't be faithful. They thought he had something of the mess room about him. He was a little rough around the edges. I mean, the Mountbattens, Anglicanised Battenbergs, had worked out that he needed to be educated in Britain, but they chose incorrectly with Gordonston. In fact, I don't think they particularly had a hand in that. If you want to get your edges knocked off and so that you're appropriately polished for court, you go to Eton. Even if you're a Scot, posh Scots went south to Eton, not some sort of new age rough and tumble boarding school. And of course, there was far too much German blood coursing through his veins. That was interesting, Michael, as well, this kind of tussle. The foreignness really struck me, just how much Britain didn't want a foreigner, a suspiciously beautiful, impoverished foreigner marrying their crown jewel. There was this poll run in the Sunday Pictorial, and predominantly men, servicemen, post-war, no, we want a Brit. Our king married a Brit. Of course, the king was a slightly quirky example to take because he wasn't actually heir to the throne when he got married to, a commoner. She does shoot right back to Robert the Bruce, I think, her lineage, Bowes Lyon, of course, Elizabeth. But I was struck by the ambivalence towards the idea of him either as a Greek, this perfidious Balkan nation, associations with fascism, couldn't get its act together, or as a German, this Teutonic blood, his sisters all married to Germans. You know, both were disastrous. So, of course, he had to be naturalised. And he was eventually. Mountbatten was he was hugely ambitious for his family at Mountbatten. I was really struck by that.
Yeah, that comes through in the book.
Yeah.
Here's a little quote from your book. You say, when Andrew Marr, in his Diamond Queen biography, writes that the immediate post-war period, only the most anodyne of references to royalty appeared in the press, that isn't true. And I was rather shocked, you've mentioned this, that one newspaper conducted a poll of readers asking whether Princess Elizabeth should marry Philip.
Yeah.
I was amazed that could be happening in the 1940s.
And and a lot of the press, the conservative press, were amazed. They thought it was unseemly, undignified, that this muscular fourth estate wasn't minding its manners. Of course, left-leaning Sunday Pictorial. The Guardian also, equally taking umbrage. After the disaster that was the abdication in 36, it was the left, and that struck me, it was the left-wing press that led the call to have a greater say over who the heir to the throne married. Whereas nowadays, I think we tend to associate it with the Sun and the Mail and the conservative press sizing up the monarchy. And in many respects, the left-wing press, like The Guardian, sort of, are a little uncomfortable around the idea of us still having this hereditary institution at the top of our country. But the poll really rattled the monarchy. It concerned them. They issued something like 7 denials between 1945 and 1947 that Elizabeth wasn't going to marry Philip. That's how long it took. It was this exhaustive process where they not only had to worry about family, courtiers, but also this new voice, this press that wanted to say. There was something else, Michael, that struck me. On the one hand, you have this vociferous criticism, analysis, people writing in, invited to write in. And on the other hand, what you do have from the conservative press is an eagerness to own the princess, to sort of inhabit her emotions and what she's going through. So a quasi inventive journalism almost on her honeymoon, which is famously, of course, she was almost crushed out of Romsey Abbey when they went for the third day into their honeymoon down in Hampshire. And the Express and the Mail writing stuff that they simply couldn't have known, like what was on the gramophone record and the food they ate on their wedding night. And so again, that very grey area, the big question of just how much can we own of the royal family? And that question was being asked in the late 1940s, and I was struck by that. And Philip was deeply uncomfortable with it.
Talking about his discomfort, let's move to the period after the Queen ascends to the throne. How difficult was it for him, you've described him as this very masculine character, to be told that his children would not bear his surname, to be told where he was going to live, and to be excluded from matters of state?
Difficult. I think he found all of it extremely uncomfortable. And some of it was, Michael, a bit unnecessary. And I'm afraid I'm going to have to put some of the blame on the late, great Churchill, who was past his prime when he was back in office in the early 50s. Lascelles, of course, a private secretary, equally needed to be put out to grass. And these two old men, they loved their peaches and cream queen, but really they could have done without the Alpha Duke tagging along. And Churchill, well, OK, so we love the name Windsor, we adore it, but could it not have been the House of Windsor and Edinburgh? Could the not, in fact, a sop to Scotland, we now think would have been really rather a good thing. And did they really have to leave Clarence House for the awful museum? Elizabeth hated Buckingham Palace when she went into age 10. It was like camping in a museum. And they'd made he loved his tech, the Duke, and it was sort of a place where he could make his own. And now we know that actually it can work perfectly well as a sort of functioning symbolic headquarters. I mean, what's going to happen with Charles and Clarence House and Buckingham Palace? And we saw the Queen latterly didn't live in Buckingham Palace.
I enjoyed this passage in your book. Quote, she confidently rebutted comparisons with her Tudor forebear, Elizabeth I, explaining that unlike the Virgin Queen, I have my husband to support me. She was not a despot, blessed with neither husband nor children. The success of Britain's 20th century monarchy was premised on marriage. Beyond the crowns and the oaths and the crowds, Elizabeth needed Philip, and it helped that she loved him. So I thought it was a very interesting comparison between the two Elizabeths.
Yeah, and there was this brilliant article. I think it might have also, was it in the Sunday Graphic? It was Margaret Thatcher, just after she'd got married, and she was campaigning to become a politician. And she uses Elizabeth as a sort of early feminist pin-up. You know, if our queen can have children, be married and also work, come on, women, why can't you? Obviously using it to help justify her own political ambitions as a married woman with about to have children. But of course it was this extraordinary line that Elizabeth walked, where actually we know that couldn't really get much more traditional than the House of Windsor, than the monarchy. But there she found herself as the sort of pin-up working mother, quite accidentally. So on the one hand, she could be the pin-up for traditionalists who very much positioned her as a wife and mother. Certainly before she became queen, there were these wonderful celebratory books of her looking at baby Charles. And then on the other hand, even second-wave feminists couldn't really have a pop at Elizabeth because she had been grinding it out all along, hadn't she, well before them in the early 50s.
Yeah, very good point. Given the weight that you put on this, the symbolism of the Queen's marriage and how it affects a whole generation, and you illustrate that very beautifully in the book by interviewing people who were married at the same time and married for similar lengths of time, should we then think that it's a failure of hers and of Philip's, that the marriages of her sister and of her children failed? The Kings, the Princess Royals, Princess Andrews. Is that failure down to them?
Yeah, it's interesting, the word failure, isn't it? Because I think it was clearly felt as a failure. I wonder if now we would frame it so much as a failure because times have changed. What I think the problem is that Philip and Elizabeth had this successful marriage. Was it companionate? Was it a more independent model of marriage? We'll probably know, but that'll take time for the real truth to seep out. But they became this frozen image of what marriage was, when beneath that image there was extraordinary social change. If you really want to understand what's happening in Britain, better to track Margaret, who, of course, wants to marry a divorcee and can't, and then, ironically, is divorced herself, the first member of a member of the royal family to get divorced in 1978. So you have these two tracks, and I think we often thought that Elizabeth was dead set against divorce. She really understood divorce because not just Margaret, close members of her family had got divorced early on, but she also understood it curdled when it came up against monarchy. And that's the problem, that's the failure, that the expectation was so high because of their success that Charles and Diana could only really fail.
And I just want to pursue that a little further, because you mentioned this statistic. It is now the case that in Britain, half of marriages end in divorce. So because you've made so much of the connection between the Queen and her generation, again, I ask you, is that her failure? I mean, in the end, was her example, as it were, not good enough? Or is it just an example of one of the many things on which the Queen was out of touch?
Was she out of touch, or was she, as I think William said in the wake of her death, someone who's still relevant today but from a different age? They were her generation were the last generation that predominantly got married and stayed married. They were and then you have this new era. The failure for monarchy is really born of their success mid-century, where they are this unifying symbol because everyone is doing what they're doing. Everyone's getting married. 500,000 kids, literally 22, the average age of a bride, is getting married in 47. Suddenly, it's a lifestyle choice, and even the half of us who choose it end up throwing it out. And therefore, it's going to be very hard for monarchy to unite in the way it did. Family monarchy was brand Windsor in the 20th century. What brand can replace that? Charles he's every man. He's the Falstaff. I'm fond of him, but he's a symbol of a more divided nation, is he not? And one who wears its flaws more overtly.
Your book, Tessa Dunlop, is called Elizabeth and Philip, and I can say that it's a very good read, and you must have produced it very quickly, and congratulations on that.